Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. Today's video is going to be the next in line for the underrated spells series. You can see the rest of this playlist linked above, and the first of these videos was the first video I ever released on this channel, where I talked about the Hypnotize spell and how it is underrated. This series is all about discussing spells that I think are good, that I know are good from my own play experience, and yet don't see much discussion in online Pathfinder discourse. Usually, these spells take the backseat in these discussions to generically powerful and iconic spells like Heal, Slow, Fireball, Synesthesia, etc. And today, the spell we'll be discussing is a direct competitor to Fear, Slow, and Synesthesia, some of these generically powerful spells that often take the foreground and cause spells like the one today to be relegated to the back. Today, we'll be talking about Vision of Death. Before we can do any analysis, let's talk about the spell at a baseline. What does Vision of Death even do? For starters, it's a 4th rank spell that targets a single creature within 120 feet and targets their will saving throw. Depending on the degree of success, it'll inflict frightened 1, 2, or 4. For success, failure, and critical failure respectively. On a critical success, of course, it does nothing. Additionally, on a critical failure, the target will be fleeing for as long as they remain frightened, which for all intents and purposes means the target is out of combat. If they're a boss, that's 3 to 4 turns of wailing on them while they cannot defend themselves or stop you in any capacity. If they're a minion or a mook, they will just leave the combat and you will have won the rest of the combat by the time they manage to come back on, say, turn 7 or so. So the critical failure is just a long-winded way of saying this target is out of the combat. Beyond just the debuffs, this spell will also inflict damage. At a baseline at 4th rank, that is 8d6 damage on a failure, halved on a success, and doubled on a critical failure. As you heighten it, each rank will give it an additional 2d6, so 10d6 at 5th rank, and so on. And the success and critical failure damage will also heighten proportionally. And finally, because of the death trait, it will instantly kill any target when it hits 0 HP due to this spell. Now, from a player perspective, this is just flavor text 99% of the time. It is horrifying to be on the receiving end of this as a player, but when you're using the spell, it's not going to make a difference. Most of the time when NPCs hit 0 HP, they're dead. I'm not saying it'll never make a difference. I have seen the death trait and similar things make a difference a couple of times at my table, but it's so negligible that I am not going to use this as a plus point for the spell. So we're going to treat the death trait's upsides as flavor text from a player perspective. And finally, let's talk about the downsides that these traits sometimes inflict on us. So first, there's the fear and the mental traits. This is a downside that you can sometimes run into, and an enemy might just be flat out immune to the spell. Mindless enemies, like constructs and zombies, the spell will completely whiff on them. And likewise, some enemies might be immune specifically to fear. So this is a meaningful downside for the spell that'll come up sometimes. Most of the time you should be fine, and honestly, with clever play and kind of paying attention to the types of enemies you're facing, you should never really be in a situation where the spell will whiff. And then there's the elephant in the room, the downsides of the death trait. Now, there are 2 popular interpretations of this I have seen, and the success of this spell is going to depend on your GM's interpretation. Some GMs say that immunity to death effects means immunity to the entire spell because it has the death trait. If that's the case, this spell will feel a lot worse at your table than it does at many tables I've played at. The tables I've played at being the other popular interpretation. This interpretation is supported by the rules, to be clear, just vaguely so. There is a rule that says if there's an immunity to a specific trait, you're only immune to the part of that effect that corresponds to that trait. The example given in the book is, let's say something has acid and fire traits, and then you use it on something that only has acid immunity, whatever portion of the spell corresponds to the fire trait will go through. Now, sometimes that's obvious. For example, if a spell deals acid damage and it deals fire damage, just ignore the acid damage, let the fire damage go through. But sometimes it's a little less obvious. The spell, for example, might also dazzle the enemy, and now you kind of have to use the flavor text to decide this. Is the dazzling from the acid burning the target's eyes? If so, it's not going to work because they're immune to acid. On the other hand, is the dazzling from like fiery smoke or something similar? In that case, it would work on the target. So there's a lot of GM interpretation to this, and that's where the death trait comes in too, because many GMs will rule this as saying that you're just immune to the instant death part of Vision of Death. You're not immune to the mental damage it would do to you, and you're not immune to the frightened it would do to you, because those are corresponding to the mental trait, which the spell also has. Now, this is vague. Personally, I think the second interpretation is the correct one, but if you're playing with a GM who uses the former interpretation, this spell is not going to be good after, say, the first couple levels where you get it, because once you reach mid-high level play, tons of enemies are randomly immune to death effects. And that can kind of suck the fun out of the spell. So just make sure you check the interpretation with your GM. I think the one where death immunity just makes you immune to the instant death part of Vision of Death and nothing else is the correct one. That's the one I'm running with for the rest of this video. But if that's not the one you agree with, you're not going to agree with my conclusions on how good this spell is. So with all of the baseline out of the way, what spells is it most likely to be compared to? Well, between 3rd and 5th rank, there are a few popular debuff spells. There is Fear, heightened to 3rd rank, there is Slow, and there is Synesthesia. These three are well-known staple spells, meta spells, so to speak, that people suggest for debuff-oriented casters. So let's compare Vision of Death one by one to these spells and figure out if Vision of Death is really good. Let's get to it. Let's start by talking about rank 3 Fear. Now this is probably the easiest comparison, that's why it's first, but basically you should view both rank 3 Fear and Vision of Death as action compression. This might not instantly be intuitive, because what am I talking about? They're both 2-action spells. All you're doing is casting a spell for 2 actions, which you've been doing since level 1, right? But think about it for a moment, like really think about it, ignore the fact that you're using the cast a spell activity and look at it a little bit deeper. What is action compression? It's really just getting to do more actions worth of value for the same action cost as you invest in it. When you start with no investment, you can do something with so many actions. For example, you might be able to stride, then leap, and then trip, and that's 3 actions. Now, if you put a little bit of investment, for example, picking up the flying tackle feat, you can do the same thing, but with fewer actions. Flying tackle lets you use 2 actions to do what previously took you 3 actions. It is 3 for 2 action compression. And once you get to higher levels, you can deepen your investment and do things with even fewer actions. For example, Juggernaut Charge is the equivalent of stride, strike, throw an enemy, and then stride after them. You're basically getting 4 for 2 actions. And that's all action compression is. So how does that apply to spells? Well, if you inspect a family of spells from the low ranks into the higher ones, you will notice that you're getting action compression for them. At levels 1 to 4, if you want to both damage a target and inflict frighten on them, you will probably spend 3 to 4 actions doing so. You might, for instance, do Demoralize followed by a 2-action damaging spell. Or you might do a 2-action Fear followed by a 1-action damaging option, which can be a strike with a backup weapon, it can be a focus cantrip like the Witch's Clinging Ice cantrip, or it can be a focus spell like Elemental Toss. Or you might even end up using 4 actions doing that much damage. You might spend turn 1 doing a Fear and then turn 2 doing a bit of damage. And then when you get to level 7 and you can use Vision of Death, you can compress this value. Instead of spending 3 to 4 actions on this, you are now spending 2 actions to frighten someone and inflict some damage. If previously you were spending 3 actions for Demoralize plus the damaging spell, or Fear plus a 1-action damaging option, now you do it in 2 actions to just straight up frighten and damage the enemy. It is a 3 for 2 compression, just like Flying Tackle above. In my opinion, while evaluating spells, it's a good idea to look at higher rank versions as action compression of the lower rank versions. It will make figuring out what you want a lot easier. So I have seen some resistance to the idea of spells being action compression when I have brought it up before, but I hope this explains my point. Because you really are just getting more value for the same number of actions that you would not be allowed to get at lower levels with a lower amount of investment. All that being said, Fear 3 and Vision of Death are just different kinds of action compression. They're good against different things. Third rank Fear is designed to compress the idea of debuffing a larger crowd. For example, at level 1, you might have cast Fear on one enemy, demoralized another, and then on a future turn, demoralized another, and now you're debuffing 3-ish enemies. Third rank Fear is just going to debuff all of them at the same time for 2 actions. Vision of Death compresses dealing with the boss. Instead of spending 3 to 4 actions debuffing them and damaging them, you're doing it all at once in 2 actions. Now, looking purely at action efficiency, like in a vacuum, in a white room, you would say Fear 3 is just better, because Fear 3 is potentially 6 for 2 or 10 for 2 action compression, whereas Vision of Death is never really better than 4 for 2 action compression. So is Fear 3 just better? No. To say one is better than the other would be to say Juggernaut Charge is better than Flying Tackle. It just inherently doesn't make much sense. Yes, Juggernaut Charge is 4 for 2 and Flying Tackle is 3 for 2, but they don't compete. They're just different parts of your toolkit. You might use Flying Tackle on turn 1 to trip an enemy and close the gap with them simultaneously, and then perhaps strike or taunt them. On the other hand, you might use Juggernaut's Charge to catch a fleeing enemy and bring them back to your party, or to go to an enemy who dived the backline and take them away from the backline. So these feats just serve 2 different purposes. The only competition here is opportunity cost of picking them as feats, but if they're both on your list, they're both good. And the same is true for Fear 3 and Vision of Death. You use Fear 3 when you see a crowd of foes. You use Vision of Death when you see a smaller number of foes. They're both really good, even if Fear 3 technically has a higher action compression ratio. So all that to say, you shouldn't really compare third rank Fear and Vision of Death. I have seen this argument used before. That is why I bring it up. When I've seen people talking about Vision of Death being good, I have seen resistance to the idea because they say it pales in comparison to third rank Fear. And in my opinion, that isn't really a sensible comparison. You bring third rank Fear for multi-target situations, you bring Vision of Death for single target situations. They don't have to compete. But what about the other single target debuff spells? Let's look at that. Now, let's compare Vision of Death to something a little more directly comparable. Slow, because this is also a single target debuff which shines in boss fights. Yet, in this case, the spells are just different enough that the idea of strictly better still cannot be true. In the previous slide, it was obvious. Anyone who thinks third rank Fear is strictly better than Vision of Death isn't really paying attention to what these 2 spells do. Slow and Vision of Death ostensibly fulfill the same role, single target debuffing. So there might be grounds for saying one is strictly better than the other, and yet they're different enough. First, they serve different roles. Slow is action denial, whereas Vision of Death is a tempo-positive debuff. Sometimes in a fight, you might want an enemy to lose 1 action. Sometimes in a fight, you might want to debuff them so your friends can hit them, and the added damage you do along the way is not that bad. They also target different saves. Slow targets Fortitude and has no relevant traits. Vision of Death targets Will and has Fear, Mental, and Death as traits. This means that there's a lot of enemies that it's not good to use Slow on, that it is good to use Vision of Death on, and vice versa. You don't want to use Vision of Death on a zombie, you don't want to use Slow on an ogre. And of course, they have different ranges. Spell ranges don't see enough discussion in online discourse. Slow has a range of 30 feet. 30 feet is a very short range. 20 to 40 feet is where throwing weapons usually operate, and because throwing weapons are designed for melee switch hitters, that should give you an idea of how much danger you're in when you're standing at 30 feet. Most monsters can get to you in 1 stride, and thus that'll make you a juicy target. Vision of Death has a 120-foot spell range. Even if you're not at the maximum distance, even if you're, say, 70 feet away, you're probably 2 strides away from most monsters. This makes you not a very good target for them to come to. So these different ranges can also matter. For instance, if we ignore the previous 2 factors of having different rolls and different saves, if you're fighting something like a Gug, you really want to be using Vision of Death from really, really far away. You don't want to be hit by the Gug having its mapless multi-attack with its 15-foot reach, right? So between all these factors, you kind of just want both of them. They complement one another really well. Where one is bad, the other is good. Where the other is bad, the first goes back to being good. You definitely want to consider both of these spells on your spell list, and so Vision of Death is comparable to Slow. Even if you think Slow is the better spell, and by the end of this video I'll explain why I don't like the idea of a better spell in the first place, but even if you think Slow is the better spell, Vision of Death still has a place on your spell list because it serves so many different roles that Slow can't cover. But now, let's talk about the big one. Let's address the elephant in the room, the much bigger elephant than the death trait. Synesthesia is viewed as the single best single target debuff in the game. This is a very popular opinion. If you go into any online discussion about debuffers, you will find a ton of people pushing the idea that Synesthesia is so singularly good that it makes the occult spell list better than the arcane spell list at debuffing. Now that's an evaluation I find a little hyperbolic. I think the arcane spell list is still the better debuffer, but that's a topic for another day. That being said, Synesthesia is a really good single target debuff, and it is good enough in the roles that Vision of Death is good at that you might wonder if it obsoletes Vision of Death, because it inflicts a negative to enemy defenses, right? So let's ignore everything else about the spells. Let's ignore the damage in Vision of Death, and let's ignore the, say, spell disruption or movement speed penalty in Synesthesia. Let's just talk about the numerical debuff this spell is going to do to AC. Just armor class. We're ignoring that Clumsy reduces reflex saves. We're ignoring that Frightened reduces everything. Let's keep the scope of the comparison narrow. Vision of Death is going to inflict Frightened 1, 2, or 4. Synesthesia is going to give a -3 to the target's AC that's going to last either for 1 round or for 1 minute. The 1 round, of course, aligns with Frightened 1's duration. The 1 minute is probably going to be as long as Frightened 4 because realistically a combat is not going to run for the full 10 rounds that a target has Synesthesia on it. But how do you evaluate this? How do you evaluate which of these is better at numerically debuffing the enemy's armor class? Let's do a little bit of math. First, let's look at the setup. What is the scenario in which we'll be evaluating these two spells? For starters, let's say the party is at 10th level, and it is fighting a 13th level monster. This is a single target boss with an armor class of 34 and a will of +23. We don't need to talk about other saves because both of these spells target will. I also chose 13th level. Normally, I choose a level +2 monster, but when we're talking about taking out the big guns, your 5th rank spell slot as a 10th level character, I think we need the monster to be 3 levels above the party because 2 levels above the party is just not that threatening once you reach the double-digit levels. Now let's take the scope of what you're doing with this debuff spell. Let's say your goal with Synesthesia or Vision of Death is to boost 2 marshals' actions. For simplicity, we're assuming nobody else is targeting AC. We will get into that later. But you're only focusing on your effect on making 2 different martial characters' options better at landing their hits. The 2 marshals in question, they're a fighter and a rogue, respectively with a +23 to hit and a +21 to hit. We are going to assume that they're permanently in flanking position. I don't like assuming that marshals are always flanking because personally I think marshals should be considering defensive options like moving out of melee. But since the rogue has the gang up feat, it's not that hard for the rogue to stay in flanking while not being at too much threat itself. And again, for simplicity, it would just make sense to take this assumption because If we did not assume flanking, we would have to account for when the rogue gets sneak attack and when it doesn't, which would just overcomplicate the math. And finally, we need to think about how many strikes or trips, we'll get there, we're attempting as part of this rotation. So let's set up what a turn for each of these marshals looks like. The fighter on their own turn is going to use Slam Down with Crashing Slam. So that's a 2-action activity. When it hits, the target is tripped. And if the target is tripped, we will assume they're standing up and getting a reactive strike off. That is 2 attack rolls made by the fighter. Both of these will hit on a 9 and crit on a 19. The rogue will simply make 2 strikes on their own turn, and if the fighter landed their hit, they will also opportune backstab. So that's 3 strikes. Respectively, they will hit on an 11, a 16, and an 11 again for the off-turn strike, and they will only crit on a natural 20. Note that noting down this threshold is important because the rogue hits on an 11. Frightened 1 is only going to increase hit chance, whereas Frightened 2 or greater would have increased crit chance as well. I also assume that both of these marshals are only using 2 actions offensively on each of their turns, and they have a 3rd action set up for something that is defensive or utilitarian in some meaningful way. This makes more sense to me than assuming that they're going to just make a strike at maximum multiple attack penalty. It's just much better to do anything else, like raise a shield, cast a shield cantrip, use a relevant skill action, move around a little bit, etc. So with all that set up, now how do we evaluate what Synesthesia does versus what Vision of Death does? We will be basing our math on the number of relevant outcomes changed. That is our metric for this comparison. For example, Vision of Death giving Frightened 1 would change the fighter's roll of an 8 from a miss to a hit, and it would change their 18 from a hit to a crit. That is 2 outcomes changed. And to be clear, these are equivalent outcomes. For example, let's assume the fighter is going to deal 20 damage on a hit. Converting a miss to a hit adds 20 damage they otherwise wouldn't have done. Converting a hit to a crit also only adds 20 damage, not 40. A crit deals 40 damage, but you were gonna do 20 of that on your hit anyways on that roll of an 18. So you only added 20 damage. So both of these are equivalently weighted outcomes, and that's why they count as 2. And likewise, Synesthesia giving Clumsy 3 would change the rogue's first attack such that 8, 9, and 10 become hits when they would have missed otherwise, and 18 and 19 become crits rather than hits. That is 5 outcomes changed. This is why it was important to note the roll on which you hit, because Clumsy 3 in theory could have changed 6 outcomes, but it did not for the rogue. Now, I tried doing this analytically by just doing out the math, drawing a probability tree so I could present you some nice, tight, detailed math. It was too long and too complicated a chain of actions. So instead, I did this programmatically. First, I will simulate a turn. So I will just roll a die, that is, I will generate a random number between 1 and 20, uniformly distributed, and just see what the die roll was. Each time an outcome is changed by the debuff, we will count that. So for example, if the target had Frightened 1 at this point in the simulation, and the fighter rolled an 8 or an 18, we will count that as 1 outcome changed. If the rogue rolled a 10, we will count that as the second outcome changed, and so on and so forth. We will repeat the simulation 100,000 times to get a measure of how frequently the spell changed 0 outcomes, how many times it changed 1 outcome, how many times it changed 2 outcomes, and so on. So for example, over a single turn, the maximum number of outcomes you could change would be 5, which means every single attack missed by the value that you debuffed. And finally, we'll repeat all of these steps for both Vision of Death and Synesthesia, since they represent different levels of debuffing. I also wanted to add, when counting outcomes, I generally count, say, if the target is Frightened 1 and the rogue is hitting, then only rolling a 10 counts as changing an outcome. But when it comes specifically to Reactive Strike and Opportune Backstab, I am adding an additional count there, where if the fighter's Crashing Slam landed because of the debuff, it automatically counts towards the Reactive Strike and the Opportune Backstab, because otherwise they would not have gotten the chance to even attempt that. So for those reactions, if they hit, and the only reason they were allowed to attempt this strike was because of a previously changed outcome, it'll automatically count as a changed outcome even if they hadn't missed by enough for the debuff to change it. And we'll be repeating the experiment for 2 different degrees of success. We'll be doing success and failure. So for success, it'd be 1 round of comparison because we're comparing frightened 1 versus clumsy 3 for 1 round. And for failure, we'll do 3 rounds of comparison. So frightened 2, which will tick down to 1 on round 2 and will be gone by round 3, versus clumsy 3 that'll stick around for the whole 3 rounds. I know clumsy 3 has a duration of 1 minute. Somebody that failed a synesthesia is not surviving 1 minute. So I think 3 rounds is fair. Why am I only doing success and failure? Why not critical failure? Because the vision of death critical failure is just better. Synesthesia is a great crit fail. The target loses 2 actions immediately and then has a monstrous debuff. Vision of death disables the target entirely. They take a whole chunk of damage, they get a monstrous debuff, and they're literally not allowed to use actions to do anything for 4 whole turns. So Vision of Death just so cleanly wins the critical failure department that I don't think it needs a comparison here. We're only going to compare success and failure. So with all of that, what does the math end up looking like? So once we take all of that setup, we run the program, we run that simulation 100,000 times, what does it end up looking like? Well, it ends up looking like this chart. This chart is comparing Vision of Death and Synesthesia on a success in terms of how many strikes they converted from misses into hits or hits into critical hits. The way you read this chart is that the vertical axis is the percent chance of the corresponding outcome. The horizontal axis is labeled from 0 to 5, and it corresponds to the number of outcomes changed on one particular run. So for example, if we look at a turn of strikes and the enemy succeeded against these spells, Vision of Death would change 0 outcomes, the blue in the leftmost column, 69.38% of the time. Whereas Synesthesia would only do so 23.42% of the time, which is way better. Vision of Death has more than 3 times the chance of changing nothing across this turn. Likewise, if you look at the next column, Vision of Death will change 1 of these 5 outcomes 20.09% of the time. Synesthesia will do so 31.26% of the time, still higher. If you look at all of this data, it looks like Vision of Death is probably going to change outcomes between 0 to 1% of the time in the majority of cases when you cast it and the enemy succeeds, whereas Synesthesia is going to do so 1 to 2% of the time. There's a chance it'll change 3 outcomes, there's a chance Vision of Death will change 2 outcomes, but by and large, you're going to change in that range. So what happens on a failure? Do things look less bleak for Vision of Death? Nope, they don't really. So now there are 16 possible buckets to fall into because you have 15 strikes being made. So the number of outcomes changed can go 0, 1, 2, all the way up till 15. Note that it is impossible for Vision of Death to ever change more than 10 outcomes because the Frightened will have expired by the 11th strike being made. Synesthesia maintains that tiny chance of doing more than 10 outcomes. For Vision of Death, that chance is just 0, a hard 0, not an approximate 0. As you can see, Synesthesia performance looks even better now. It seems like on average, you're going to change 3 to 5 outcomes across these 3 rounds, whereas Vision of Death is still probably changing 1 to 2 outcomes. You can also see that Synesthesia has a really safe distribution here. Because of that bell curve-like appearance, it is very likely to change between 2 and 7 outcomes, and it'll only change 0 outcomes 1-ish% of the time. Whereas Vision of Death still has a 1 in 3 chance of changing nothing across these 3 rounds, while having a pretty good chance of changing something regardless. All in all, things look bleak for Vision of Death here, but that's sort of by design. This is how I kind of designed the problem, because I said let's focus on the numerical debuff just to armor class so that we can compare these spells in the narrowest scope possible. And now that we have done that, we can start applying other heuristics to understand when Vision of Death is good and when Synesthesia is better. Now, with all of this math informing our perspective, let's do a proper analysis of Vision of Death versus Synesthesia. Firstly, if you look just at lowering enemy armor class so that your martial buddies can hit, Synesthesia trounces Vision of Death. It is not a close contest. We can look at this pretty simply by looking at the average number of outcomes changed. You can do this by taking a weighted average of the percents on each of the previous charts and multiplying them by the number of outcomes that they correspond to. Vision of Death on a success is going to change 0.46 outcomes. Synesthesia, 1.5 outcomes. And then on a failure, the difference is even bigger. Vision of Death is changing 1.36 outcomes, whereas Synesthesia is changing 4.52. And remember, averages never tell the full story. When you go back to the chart before, the numbers are actually more bleak than the average suggests, because that 4.52 is coming from a situation where the Synesthesia is almost never going to change 0 outcomes. Whereas Vision of Death, it's 1.36, comes from a situation where 1 in 3 times you do this, you're changing 0 outcomes. So the difference is bleak. And this is why I like narrowing the scope for the mathematical analysis, because now it tells us how much of a difference Vision of Death needs to make up for in other ways to then be tied with Synesthesia or be slightly worse or slightly better, right? And in my opinion, it does make up for it in these other ways. First, let's look at the obvious one. We ignored the damage Vision of Death gets to deal. Synesthesia does not deal damage, while Vision of Death does. So now let's do a mathematical trick. If you take these two marshals whom we're buffing and look at their damage, so the rogue with a d6 weapon with a striking rune, a d6 property rune, and let's say the thief or ruffian racket so they can add their full strength or dex to their damage, and weapon specialization, they would average 25.5 damage on a hit, double that on a crit. Let's pretend deadly, fatal, etc. do not exist right now. Likewise for the fighter, let's assume a d10 reach weapon because they're a reactive strike built fighter. Let's give them a striking rune, a d6 property rune, and let's acknowledge that their weapon specialization is a little bigger, it's 3 instead of 2, and we'll get 22.5 average damage. Again, we'll assume it just doubles on a crit and not worry about deadly or fatal, and of course in the rogue's case we're also ignoring debilitations. That's fine, we have to keep the math tractable. The midpoint of these two numbers is 24. 24 can now serve as a reference value for how much value one changed outcome adds. Changing a miss into a hit is like going from 0 to 24 damage. Changing a hit into a crit is like going from 24 to 48 damage. So either way, it's a plus 24. That's what one outcome changed means. And if this midpoint serves as a reference for what one outcome changed, then the damage Vision of Death can be incorporated into those outcomes. For example, if your Vision of Death in either of these two circumstances dealt exactly 24 damage, it would have been fair to say that Vision of Death changed 1.46 outcomes instead of 0.46 / 2.36 instead of 1.36, because you added the damage of one changed outcome and then you started changing outcomes. So let's look at the damage Vision of Death actually does. It's going to be 10d6 because we have heightened it to 5th rank to keep up with Synesthesia being 5th rank. So on a success, you would deal 17.5 average damage. Let's take that as a proportion of 24. 17.5 divided by 24. That will tell us how much of a proportion of one outcome you have changed. And in this case, adding that to that original 0.46 would mean that on a success, Vision of Death is changing closer to 1.19 outcomes, much closer to the 1.5 from Synesthesia. Likewise, on a failure, you average 35 damage. So you will change the above 1.36 into a 2.82, because 35 damage is bigger than 24. So it's like more than one outcome changed when we're talking averages. And again, 2.82 is much closer to 4.52 than the original 1.36 was. So even with just the damage, we can see this gap starting to close. Synesthesia is no longer leaps and bounds ahead, even though we're still actually just looking at how much damage you did to an enemy and how much you helped your marshals deal damage to an enemy. The success is very close, and the failure, it's not very close, but it's much closer than it looked like earlier. It's less bleak. But of course, Vision of Death is not just changing hits, misses into hits, or hits into crits. It's doing other things too. So far, the only outcomes we have looked at are martial hits and damage-based equivalents of martial hits. But Vision of Death is changing saving throws too. Frightened impacts enemy saves, which means we assume that you're casting this debuff and there's two martials. If you have a fourth party member who is a spellcaster, your Frightened is also going to help them land a spell. That's another shot at changing an outcome that Synesthesia may not have been as good at changing. Synesthesia will only debuff Reflex, which means if your ally wanted to use, say, Slow, another good debuff, it's not going to do anything. Meanwhile, Vision of Death will impact your ally's use of Slow. And in the scenario we set up, the one where you're fighting a level +3 monster, action denial is important. So Slow, trying to stack that with, say, your fighter's attempts at tripping is a really important and valuable part of beating the single target boss. And Synesthesia will not be helping out in that. That's not to say Synesthesia is not helping the caster. The caster might still just cast a Thunder Strike and benefit from that -3, or they might just cast their own attack roll spell. Because when the enemy has a Synesthesia stuck to them is a really good time to be casting attack roll spells. But the truth is that Frightened is more likely to make a difference because it impacts all saving throws. It is also much likelier to debuff enemy offenses. Synesthesia is only going to affect dexterity-based offenses from enemies. Now, of course, there are NPCs that are going to use dexterity as their main attacking stat. I think it's fair to say that strength is more commonly the main attacking stat. And more importantly, if one monster makes use of both strength and dexterity in different attacks, the strength-based ones tend to be the more dangerous ones, whereas the dex-based ones tend to be backup options. And of course, Frightened also affects saving throw DCs of spells the enemy may cast. It will also affect their athletics, which they might be using to grab or trip your party members. So Vision of Death changes a lot of outcomes that are not just hits against armor class. And remember, the change gets magnified on a failure. Just like how in the case of damage, the success changed about 0.8 of an outcome, whereas the failure changed about 1.5 of an outcome. It's the same here. When an enemy is Frightened 2 for one round and Frightened 1 for the next round, they're much, much more likely to fail an athletics check because of you, take another effect from a spell that a friend cast because of you, worsen the impact of a spell they cast because of you, and so on. So I think it would be fair to say that with this accounted for, Synesthesia and Vision of Death would appear to be dead even. Because with the damage accounted for, the success was already very close and the failure was far apart, but now that that gap gets another jump, and again, the failure gets a bigger jump, I would say Vision of Death and Synesthesia look dead even. But of course, I was ignoring that Synesthesia inflicts concealed on the enemy. They have to treat everything as concealed while they're affected by Synesthesia. It can also disrupt concentrate actions, which will help with that spell difference that we talked about earlier. There's a DC 5 flat check assigned to a lot of different things the enemy might do. And of course, there's a movement speed penalty that is a minor advantage of Synesthesia over Vision of Death. So again, Synesthesia now pulls a little ahead again in this comparison. But now let's talk about other factors that go beyond just the numerical effect. Vision of Death still has the longer range than Synesthesia. This is a meaningful upside. When you're fighting that PL+3 boss, do you want to be standing 30 feet away from the enemy? For example, that level 13 enemy could be an adult adamantine dragon. That dragon has a range of 15 to 20 feet on a lot of its attacks. Do you think you'd be happy standing 30 feet away from an adult adamantine dragon, where they can just perhaps step once to make sure they can move past your allies without triggering reactions, and then bite you, and if they land the hit, they will restrain you after with improved grab. And that bite attack will restrain you. They have a +27 to athletics and don't suffer the multiple attack penalty while using it. And this is a free action after they hit you with their bite. Standing 30 feet away from the types of enemies you're going to be using Synesthesia and Vision of Death the most on is dangerous. And being 120 feet away is a lot less dangerous. Even being 70 feet away would be a lot less dangerous. So I would definitely count its much longer range as a pretty big upside for Vision of Death. And of course, Vision of Death just has the crazier critical failure effect. That is a minor upside because the types of enemies you're going to be using these spells on are not that likely to critically fail. But it is an upside. 1 in 20 times you cast either of these spells, even on a higher level boss, the enemy is still gonna crit fail. And when that happens, Vision of Death is substantially better, and there's really no contest there. I have seen people say Slow's critical failure is better than Vision of Death. I have seen people even say Synesthesia is better than Vision of Death. I don't get it. Vision of Death's critical failure quite explicitly tells you that the enemy is not allowed to do anything for 4 turns. It's a crazy good critical failure effect. So when you look at this whole picture, the number of outcomes changed, but not just in attacks against AC, but also against saves made by the enemy, saves the enemy asks your party to make, etc. And also in terms of the disruption that Synesthesia sometimes inflicts on enemies, and also the damage that Vision of Death does, and also Vision of Death's longer range, other downsides like its traits, like the death trait. When you take all of these factors, when you look at the whole picture, I would say they're pretty evenly matched, and they're pretty comparable spells. One might be strictly better or worse than the other, circumstantially. So earlier I said against the adult adamantine dragon, you don't want to be casting Synesthesia because, yeah, you'll improve your friend's ability to hit that dragon, and then you'll get restrained and perhaps die. But conversely, against a Dryad Queen, you probably want to cast Synesthesia because you will debuff the Dryad Queen's main strike, and you will potentially disrupt spells that they cast. This also depends on your own party composition. I assumed 2 marshals, and then for the sake of argument, assume there was another caster. If you have 3 marshals, Synesthesia is probably just better. If you have 2 casters and 1 marshal, Vision of Death is almost certainly better. And sometimes your own role in the party can impact things too. For example, if you're the party's main healer, you're going to be within 30 feet of the melee anyways, so the Vision of Death range upside doesn't exist. This could be the case if, say, you're a bard who is debating these 2 spells, but that's not always the case. Maybe you're not the primary healer, and in that case, Synesthesia forcing you to be closer to melee is a tangible downside. There's a lot of variations, and because these spells are so close to even, because of that closeness, any number of factors can move it up or down. Evaluate things case by case. Look at your party composition, your role within your party composition, and look at the enemies you're fighting, or enemy you're fighting in this case, and then evaluate which one is better than the other. There truly isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. So, what is the final verdict? Well, in my opinion, Vision of Death is a strong spell, and criminally underrated. People don't talk about Vision of Death enough, and I think it's because it's sandwiched between these all-stars. Fear 3, Slow, Synesthesia. These are all spells at 3rd and 5th rank respectively that are obviously good and powerful and a little flashy. And Vision of Death is subtly good. And that kind of makes it not stand out. But I hope my arguments today have convinced you that it is also an all-star debuff. When it comes to Slow, Fear 3, and Vision of Death, I think it's fair to say that it's just wrong to call one of those strictly better than Vision of Death. They just serve entirely different roles. When you want action denial, Slow is better, but at other times Vision of Death is better. When you want a multi-target option, Fear is obviously better, but that doesn't make Vision of Death irrelevant because single-target enemies exist and Fear 3 is not really useful against those. It's not even different than a Fear 1. So those 3 spells, they're just all good debuffs that all deserve a place on a dedicated debuffer's spell list. Synesthesia is where things get a little complicated because it would be fair on your part to look at all the comparisons in the past couple slides and come away thinking Synesthesia is better. I think they're tied, but if you think Synesthesia is better, something in your table experience has trained you to value attacks against armor class more than my table experience has taught me to value. Conversely, my table experience has taught me to value Frightened because it debuffs enemy defenses and saves more than you value it, and I don't think the Concealed and Concentrated Disruption are making up for that gap. It's fine for me to think they're tied and you to think Synesthesia is better, because that's table variance. But I hope that I have at least convinced you that it's a close contest. Because if you agree it's a close contest, then circumstantially, Vision of Death is better. Remember that synesthesia being better in a vacuum, being generally better, means that when you compare synesthesia and Vision of Death, synesthesia might be better 7 out of 10 times, and Vision of Death better 3 out of 10 times. But those 3 out of 10 times matter. It's good to have Vision of Death on your spell list for those 3 out of 10 times, provided that you're not paying too hefty an opportunity cost. And now let's look at a level 10 bard that's focused on debuffing enemies. Their spell list will probably look something like this from ranks 1 to 5. We're ignoring cantrips. I don't think they really matter in this conversation. You have a wide variety of utility options like Helpful Steps, Liberating Command, Translocate, a wide variety of multi-target options like Fear, Inner Radiance Torrent, Command, Synaptic Pulse, so on and so forth. And this is where I'm going to get on a little bit of a soapbox. It really grinds my gears when people talk about spells being one-to-one better than one another, because what character have you ever built that picks one spell? Even kineticists at level 1 are picking 2 impulses that are not Elemental Blast, not just one. So why would you ever compare a spell purely one-to-one? Spells come in packages. For example, the package I mentioned earlier of Inner Radiance Torrent, Fear, Command, and Synaptic Pulse. This is your area package. It does not interact with Slow and Containment, being your Action Denial package. Laughing Fit is part of your Silver Bullets package. At higher levels, you would have other spells that add to your Silver Bullet package. Right now, it's just Laughing Fit. These packages kind of don't need to interact with one another. Every spell I have put on this list serves a purpose. Every spell that's on this list is good to have on this list. And if you took any of these spells and replaced it one-to-one with what the meta considers a better spell, quote-unquote, you'd probably make for a worse spell list. For example, if you took this exact spell list and, I don't know, you cut Lose the Path for Fear, because Fear is this evergreen meta spell that you can always cast from first rank and generate value from, it's going to be a worse spell list. You're going to cast a first rank Fear basically never. In the rare instance that you're down to even considering it, it'll probably still be worse than something you could have done from a wand, a staff, a scroll, a focus spell, or a cantrip. I have bolded 4 spells on here. These are all 4 debuffs we talked about today because all 4 of them are good to have on the spell list. Calling one strictly better than the other doesn't make sense. I already made my point with Fear and Slow, but now Vision of Death and Synesthesia are both on the spell list. Why? Because they were close enough that even though Vision of Death is slightly worse, you probably still want it. There are going to be situations that Vision of Death is better to cast in, like the Adult Adamantine Dragon I talked about on the previous slide. There are going to be other situations, maybe more such situations, where Synesthesia is better to cast, but ultimately Vision of Death is still good to have on your list. So when evaluating spells, don't fall for the trap of considering whether a spell is individually better than other alternatives all the time. That is a factor, but that cannot be the only factor. Look at the full package of spells. Look at what variety and coverage and options it gives you. Look at how each spell you've picked fills out the roles it's trying to fill out, and see if you're paying too hefty an opportunity cost for something. And in my opinion, it makes a lot of sense to have both of these spells as a debuffer. To talk a little more generally, Vision of Death also occupies a little bit of a generalist spot. It is both a damage and a debuff. It is great to cast when you don't know what's better, damage or debuff. And that also makes it really good on a prepared spellcaster's list. I talked about a bard here, and they're spontaneous, and spontaneous casters inherently have that little bit more flexibility to use exactly the spell they want. So maybe the bard is going to use Fear, Slow, or Synesthesia in 90% of the cases and have Vision of Death just for the remaining 10%, but a prepared caster might want Vision of Death because it serves a dual purpose. It can be a damage spell, it can be a debuff spell. It is a multimodal spell, as I talked about in my prepared casters video, and that makes it valuable there too. That's another upside for Vision of Death to consider that I did not bring up so far in this video because it's kind of specific. So that'll be all for today's video, folks. I hope I have changed some minds on Vision of Death. Maybe you already thought this was a great spell. I know plenty of people do, But in my experience, the online discourse really underrates this spell. It really talks about the spell like it's kind of like taking a backseat to all of these all-stars, and I vehemently disagree. I think Vision of Death is a fantastic spell. I think Vision of Death belongs on good debuffers' spell lists, provided they have access to it, and I hope I've convinced you of that too. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you can, please join a channel membership. It is a small monthly fee to directly support me without worrying about advertisements. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.